Benito Mussolini is remembered today, it is as a vain, boastful jackal, a bombastic, overdressed dictator who rode on Adolf Hitler's coattails into war and who paid the ultimate price for his ambition. But Mussolini was much more than a self-important clown. His rise to power in the 1920s made him one of the most admired and feared politicians in Europe. The inventor of modern fascism, Mussolini was the model on which Hitler based his own rise to power. Indeed, it could be argued that without Mussolini, Adolf Hitler would never have come to anything. Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini, the self-styled modern Caesar, ruled Italy from 1922 until he was deposed in July 1943. His career was contradictory. A left-wing activist in his youth, he became leader of an archetypal right-wing party which set the pattern for 20th century dictatorships. Initially, an anti-militarist opposed to Italy's participation in the First World War, he built up the Italian army and navy in the 1920s and 30s, launching imperialist military campaigns in the Balkans and in Africa. He gave the world the concept of fascism, and for many years was its leading proponent. His example and influence were crucial in the development of right-wing governments elsewhere in Europe. Hitler based many of the institutions of Nazi Germany on the Italian model. But Mussolini's dominance did not last. In 1933, the German Führer cut a very dowdy figure next to the flamboyant Italian leader. And it was only Italian acquiescence which made Hitler's pre-war territorial gains possible. However, by 1939, there was no doubt that Berlin had become dominant and that Rome was very much the junior partner. Mussolini knew that Italy was not ready for a general European conflict, and he remained neutral in the first year of World War II. However, the heady German triumphs of 1939 and 1940 convinced the Italian dictator to play a full part in the Axis war effort, a part which would eventually bring his downfall and Italy's ruin. Benito Mussolini was born at Predappio near Ravenna on the 29th of July, 1883. His father, a blacksmith, was the socialist mayor of the town. His mother was a schoolteacher. The young Benito was an unruly child who reluctantly followed his mother into teaching, a profession he detested. In 1902, he fled to Switzerland to avoid conscription. He worked as a laborer, but spent more time as a political agitator. He returned to Italy in 1904, where he eventually completed his military service with the 10th Bersaglieri Regiment. Returning to teaching, he was jailed in 1908 for creating civil unrest. Active in the Partito Socialista Italiani, or PSI, he eventually gave up teaching for journalism, and by 1912 was editing the Milan daily Avanti. He'd become a leading figure in the Italian Socialist Party and opposed Italy's war with Turkey. By the end of 1914, however, his political stance had moved from internationalism to nationalism, and he supported Italian participation in World War I on the side of Britain and France. His former belief in Marxist revolution had evolved into nationalism, which he believed to be a far more potent popular force. Expelled from the PSI, along with the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio, he founded a newspaper called Popolo d'Italia. Funding for the paper came from an odd mixture of revolutionary trades unionists, radical Republicans, right-wing nationalists, and the futurists, visionaries who worshipped strength, technology, and warfare. This bizarre coalition was to become the foundation of fascism. In 1915, Mussolini married Rachele Guidi, who had already borne his daughter Edda and son Vittorio. 5 further children followed. Rachele was devoted to Mussolini, in spite of a succession of mistresses, and Mussolini himself was to record that she was the only woman he really loved. Married life had to be delayed, however, since that autumn he'd been called up for war service with the 11th Bersaglieri Regiment. Italy had declared war on Austria and her allies in May 1915, and Mussolini had written a leader in Popolo d'Italia in which he stated that, "From today there are only Italians. All Italians are united in a shield of steel. General Cardona has unsheathed the sword and will advance to take Vienna. Viva l'Italia!" Mussolini had come a long way since his original military service, when he had been something of a vagabond. His prior experience stood him in good stead, and he was quickly promoted to corporal. He fought on the Isonzo front in the series of great battles which proved so costly to the Italian army. In 5 separate engagements in the last 3 months of 1915, the Italians lost more than 100,000 men. Mussolini fought bravely, and in 1916 was promoted to Caporal Maggiore, or Lance Sergeant. In February 1917, he was seriously injured during a training exercise by an exploding mortar. Invalided out of the army, after 6 months he returned, still on crutches, to the Popolo d'Italia. There he resumed his career as an outspoken journalist, whose primary targets were the pacifist socialists. However, the war continued to attract most of the attention of the Italian people, and few paid heed to the theory of national revolution which Mussolini was developing. It was not until the war ended that he rose again from obscurity, lifted on a tide of anti-socialist feeling. In Milan on March the 23rd, 1919, at a meeting of 118 war veterans and disillusioned socialists, he announced the foundation of the Fasci di Combattimento, or combat group. The name Fasci harked back to the bundle of sticks which were the symbol of the magistrates in ancient Rome. At much the same time, another discontented war veteran was taking his first steps into the political arena. In Munich, Adolf Hitler was assuming control of a right-wing fringe group known as the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Although springing from very different roots, both organizations exhibited a number of similarities. The Fasci di Combattimento was primarily a nationalist party, and like Hitler's nascent Nazis, it got considerable support from embittered ex-servicemen. These felt betrayed by post-war politicians and wanted a just reward for the blood they had spilled. The Fasci were encouraged by businessmen and other vested interests who were fearful of the possibility of a Bolshevik revolution. But Mussolini got little backing from the trade unions, and in 1919 he failed to get elected to parliament. Fascism got its big chance with the widespread workers' demonstrations in the autumn of 1920. Although the Liberal government weathered the storm, Mussolini decided to exploit the fears of the moneyed classes by forming armed squads to destroy socialist organizations. Mussolini's influence grew swiftly. He recruited discontented socialists, veterans, the unemployed, all the dissidents who believed that only a ruthless dictator could revitalize Italy. He molded them into a private, black-shirted army. The movement grew far more quickly than Hitler's Nazi party. Mussolini and 35 other fascists were elected to parliament in May 1921. The party gained strength by the activities of fascist squadre or squads, small groups set up in provincial capitals to take direct action against socialists and trades unionists. Their activities foreshadowed those of Hitler's stormtroopers. They wrecked and burned out socialist offices and printing presses and attacked opponents with clubs, knives and guns. Fascist membership increased dramatically from under 1,000 in 1920 to over 250,000 2 years later. In the summer of 1922, the fascists were strong enough to break up an attempted national strike by the trade unions. In October of that year, Mussolini's supporters made their famous March on Rome. 30,000 armed fascists concentrated at Naples and threatened a popular insurrection aimed at the capital. Mussolini was not with them. He had remained in Milan. It is a fascist myth that the March on Rome lifted Mussolini into power. In fact, a consensus had arisen among right-wing politicians, the Vatican, intellectuals, journalists, industrialists, and large landholders. They felt that it was time that the government was taken in hand and that fascism should be given a chance to see what it could do. Most felt that once in power, Mussolini and his black shirts could be brought to heel, much as the Prussian aristocracy would try to tame Hitler 10 years later. The Liberal government wanted to proclaim a state of emergency, but after some indecision, King Victor Emmanuel III refused to support them. Prime Minister Factor resigned, and the king invited Mussolini to join the government. Mussolini, by now known as Il Duce, or the leader, refused to join any government he did not lead, a tactic which would also be used by Hitler. On October the 29th, 1922, the king gave Mussolini the task of forming a new cabinet as Italy's youngest ever prime minister. Only then, with everything settled, did Mussolini give the word for the black shirts to march. Mussolini acted cautiously at first. His first cabinet was mostly non-fascist, but over the next 2 years, infighting among the other political parties allowed Il Duce to concentrate power into his own hands. This was not too hard, since he was at one and the same time Prime Minister, Minister of the Interior, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Minister for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. In January 1923, he created the Fascist Grand Council, with members nominated by himself. In February, he converted the fascist armed squads into a private army by proclaiming them the Milizia Volontaria per la Sicurezza Nazionale, or Volunteer Militia for National Security. In the 1924 elections, the fascists secured 65% of the recorded votes. One person who had watched Mussolini's success with great interest was Adolf Hitler. He believed the fascist myth that the march of the armed black shirts had pressured the king into making Mussolini prime minister, and he resolved to use similar tactics in his own grab for power. On November the 8th, 1923, Hitler interrupted a patriotic meeting held by senior Bavarian politicians at the Burger Braukeller beer hall in Munich. As Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the Bavarian state commissioner, was speaking, Hitler and Hermann Goering entered the hall surrounded by supporters. Hitler strode up to the stage, drew a pistol, and fired a shot into the ceiling. "The national revolution has broken out," he shouted. "The hall is filled with 600 armed men. No one is allowed to leave. The Bavarian government and the government of Berlin are hereby deposed. A new government will be formed at once. The barracks of the Reichswehr and the police barracks are occupied. Both have rallied to the swastika. Tomorrow will find a national government in Germany, or it will find us dead." The following day, between 2,000 and 3,000 men formed up with Hitler, General Erich Ludendorff, Goering, and Julius Streicher at their head. At Feldherrenhalle, a line of 100 police blocked the road. Hitler called on the police to surrender. A shot was sounded, and then in a flurry of fire, 16 Nazis and 3 policemen were dead. Although Hitler escaped, he was later arrested and sentenced to 5 years in the comfortable fortress prison of Landsberg. In fact, he served barely 9 months of his term, but during that time he came to realize that the route to power could only come from the ballot box. In 1923, Hitler could never have succeeded like Mussolini. His Nazi party was too small and too local. It had some influence in Bavaria, but lacked the nationwide organization of Mussolini's black shirts. Above all, the Nazis lacked the broad-based political and financial support enjoyed by Il Duce. Mussolini's acceptance of the rule of law was only skin deep. His most vociferous opponent, Giacomo Matteotti, was murdered by the black shirts on the 10th of June 1924, and the resulting outcry nearly nipped fascism in the bud. Mussolini survived by showing personal outrage and pretending to direct a vigorous hunt for the assassins. On January the 3rd, 1925, Mussolini felt secure enough to announce his assumption of full dictatorial powers. Opposition parties and journals were suppressed. The fascist dictatorship had begun, and, as Hitler was defined in Germany, the opposition parties played into Mussolini's hands by falling back on passive resistance. On the face of it, Il Duce's authoritarian rule was successful. He raised national confidence from its post-war depths. He launched land reclamation projects, increased agricultural production, stabilized the currency, and created a navy and air force to match the best in the world. He even made the trains run on time, no mean achievement in the Italy of the 1920s. But Mussolini's social reforms were largely superficial. He insisted on concentrating power into fascist hands, which in effect meant into his own. The economic measures he pushed through were more for show than substance, and some of his other schemes, like trying to recreate the glories of the Roman Empire, would have been more appropriate on the comic opera stage than in real life. Il Duce took the final step into tyranny in 1928, when he suspended parliamentary government. He had become absolute dictator of a fascist corporate state. But the bombastic tyrant genuinely respected the monarchy, which helped give him a broad popular base. His most lasting achievement was the Lateran Treaty of 1929. In this concordat with the papacy, he established the present Vatican City state. As dictator, Mussolini finally had the power to make all decisions. He expanded the existing Italian colonies in Libya and in East Africa, and in 1935 invaded Ethiopia. 2 years later, he had completed the conquest of that backward country. In 1939, he annexed the Italian protectorate of Albania, boasting that he was regaining the glory and prestige of ancient Rome. Mussolini had shown considerable shrewdness and flexibility in his early days. As the years passed, however, Il Duce became a vain, strutting megalomaniac. Mussolini ha sempre ragione. Mussolini is always right was a key slogan of his regime. But in Adolf Hitler, the vain-glorious Duce more than met his match. The two dictators first met in Venice in 1934. Mussolini was very much the dominant figure, his Italian general's uniform in marked contrast to Hitler's civilian suit and shabby raincoat. Il Duce was not wildly impressed by the Führer. During their meeting, Hitler talked too much, he told his aides, and instead of discussing the European situation, insisted on quoting large tracts of Mein Kampf. By the time of their next meeting in Berlin in 1937, things had changed. The Nazis were determined to impress and put on a brilliant spectacle. Hitler and Mussolini addressed a mass rally of 250,000 people in the Maifeld, which had been built for the 1936 Olympic Games. Hitler visited Italy again in May 1938, and the Italians did their best to match the Berlin show of the year before. This time the talks had some substance, but it became clear that Hitler was now the senior partner in the alliance. In broadcasts and in newspapers during World War II, British and American reporters referred to Germany and its allies as the Axis. This was useful shorthand, especially in North Africa, where the Germans and Italians were fighting side by side. The Axis acquired its name on the 22nd of May 1939, when Hitler and Mussolini signed a military alliance. With typical bombast, it was promoted as the Pact of Steel. But Mussolini had introduced the metaphor 3 years earlier, hailing German-Italian cooperation at the time of the Spanish Civil War. The Berlin-Rome line is not a diaphragm, but rather an axis, he said, meaning that the 1936 negotiations between the two fascist dictators were not to define their boundaries, but to coordinate a common foreign policy. Mussolini was wrong. He had been ruling Italy for 11 years when Hitler became Chancellor, but the master-pupil relationship he nourished during the Nazi struggle for power vanished after 1933. Hitler had borrowed some of the trappings of the Italian fascists for his own movement, but once in power was determined to be the master. The German Führer had to step carefully at first. The attempted Nazi coup in Austria in 1934 infuriated Mussolini, who regarded Vienna as within the Italian sphere of influence. Mussolini's reaction to the murder of Chancellor Dollfuss was to dispatch 4 divisions to the Brenner Pass and force Hitler to disassociate himself from the Austrian Nazis. German control of Austria would have to wait until 1938. In the interlude, Hitler threw off the shackles imposed at Versailles, reoccupying the Rhineland, reintroducing conscription, and unveiling his secretly trained air force. Mussolini's attempt to expand his empire by invading Abyssinia, Ethiopia, met with international condemnation led by Britain. The Abyssinian adventure, in which the Italians used aircraft and poison gas, revealed how far short Italy fell from achieving world power status. However, it also showed Hitler how easily the Western democracies could be manipulated and intimidated. The war lost Italy its few remaining diplomatic ties with Western Europe. Drawn to the successful Hitler and pushed by the British, Mussolini aligned Italy with Germany, and the 2 fascist states joined to support the nationalist cause during the Spanish Civil War. To counter Soviet aid to the Republicans, both Germany and Italy sent military aid to General Francisco Franco and the nationalists in 1936. A year later, Mussolini had committed ground forces, and more than 30,000 Italian troops were playing an active part in the war. In spite of serious Italian defeats at Guadalajara and Huejega, the nationalists emerged triumphant. The fighting confirmed the poor quality of the Italian army, but locked the 2 main fascist powers into a firmer alliance. The relationship was strained in March 1938 when Hitler finally marched into Austria. Although Mussolini was outraged by the Nazi takeover, Il Duce earned Hitler's undying gratitude by promptly condoning the act. Mussolini was even more valuable to Hitler later in the year. During the Munich crisis, at Hitler's instigation, the Italian dictator set up and conducted the conference between the Axis powers, Britain and France. The agreement sealed the fate of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, which Germany annexed in 1939. Il Duce was at the height of his power, playing a leading role on the European political stage. He turned his trip to Munich into another state visit, and his return home was conducted like a Roman triumph. The Pact of Steel creating the Rome-Berlin axis was signed on the 22nd of May 1939. Mussolini did not expect to be ready for World War until 1943, but his negotiators shaped the agreement so it seemed to guarantee Italy's safety from German aggression. And he had his own agenda if war should break out. To his intimates, he announced plans to annex Malta, Corsica and Tunis. The German-Italian alliance was never regarded as an equal partnership in Berlin. Although Mussolini had spoken for years about the virtues and honor of battle and of Italy's readiness to fight, the German High Command judged that the Italians were completely unprepared for a modern war. In any case, Hitler's generals did not trust their allies. Most had been junior officers in World War I, when Italy had abrogated its membership of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary to join the British and the French. Suspicions of Italian reliability were of course proved right. In 1943, when an Anglo-American invasion force landed on mainland Italy, the Italians changed sides. Hitler's alliance with Italy never deepened like the Anglo-American special relationship. Although menaced by generals' egos, mutual suspicion and confusion over post-war objectives, the British and Americans integrated their military operations to a remarkable degree. The level of coordination they achieved is often obscured by memoirs that stress the arguments over strategy. But at least they talked. In 1940, Britain and France naturally assumed the anticipated German invasion would be supported by an Italian attack. In fact, the Germans never involved Italy in their invasion plans, and Mussolini's last-minute declaration of war on France was regarded as the work of a political jackal. Germany was on the verge of winning the Battle of France. The French army had collapsed and surrender seemed imminent. Most neutral observers felt that the British would then make peace. Perhaps Mussolini thought that Italy would be the next target for Nazi aggression if he did not help Hitler win. Alternatively, he may simply have been moved to grab a piece of France before it was too late. The Italians invaded France with 32 divisions, crossing the frontier along the Riviera coast and in the Alpes Maritimes. It was the first sign that Italian contributions to the war would not be heroic. The invasion force was thrown back by just 6 French divisions. It was not an isolated instance of Italian military incompetence. The jackal made the mistake of attacking a second victim on its own. Without informing Germany, Italy invaded Greece. Instead of staging triumphal parades through Athens, the Italian army met fierce resistance and ended the year bogged down in the mountains of Albania with a lengthening casualty list. Only when the predatory Germans descended into the Balkans in April 1941 did the Italian forces advance again. More disasters came in Egypt when Marshal Graziani invaded the British protectorate with 125,000 men. A scratch Commonwealth force of 31,000 men under Major General Richard O'Connor defeated the invaders. In a brilliant campaign, the Desert Force threw Graziani's vastly bigger army back 800 kilometers, taking 130,000 prisoners in the process. Only the arrival of General Erwin Rommel and the German Afrika Corps redressed the balance. Italian humiliation in the Balkans, in North Africa and at sea, where the Royal Navy quickly proved more than a match for the Italian fleet, sealed the Italian reputation as second-rate fighting men. In a way, that was unfair. Italian soldiers were capable of great bravery, but given poor leadership and even worse equipment, they had no chance to shine. In the words of one Italian commentator, "Large new warships did no good when the admirals commanding them were unwilling to risk defeat. Brave and well-trained pilots could do very little when most of them were flying obsolete, lightly armed biplanes that looked good at an air show but could not hope to catch modern bombers. Soldiers and sailors who lack confidence in their leaders and equipment are not eager to make up for it with their blood." By this time, the Axis included a third major force. On the 27th of September 1940, the Japanese Empire formally concluded a defense alliance with Germany and Italy. Fortunately for the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, the Japanese war effort was never coordinated with Germany. Hitler's alliance with Mussolini dragged Germany into a Balkan sideshow she did not want, diverting resources badly needed elsewhere. While Italy did contribute substantially to the Russian front in 1942, 250,000 men in the Italian Eighth Army, the campaign in North Africa, not to mention the festering guerrilla war in Yugoslavia, tied down significant German forces. One area in which Mussolini did not follow the Hitler line was in his policy towards the Jews. Soon after Hitler came to power, Mussolini said, "National pride has no need of the delirium of race." Italian fascists had to perform verbal somersaults to explain away Mussolini's anti-racist statements to their German fellows. However, in 1938, Il Duce was forced to pass anti-Jewish laws both to appease an extreme faction within the fascist party and to cement the alliance with the Third Reich. Italy's 57,000 Jews were officially excluded from public jobs, public schools, and many professions. Anti-Semitic signs appeared in shop windows all over Italy. It was a persecution honored more in the breach than the observance, and not until German forces occupied the country in 1943 did the true horrors of the final solution descend upon Italy. Some 15,000 Jews, about 20% of Italian Jewry, were rounded up and shipped off to the death camps in 1944 and 1945. But this was in the future. For the moment, Mussolini was content to play second fiddle to Adolf Hitler in the campaigns against the Allies. After the German disaster at Stalingrad, where the Italian Eighth Army was among German satellite forces, Mussolini formed a new government in February 1943. Il Duce personally took over from Ciano as foreign minister. 2 months later, after Axis troops were annihilated in North Africa and the Germans were being driven back through the Ukraine, Mussolini visited Hitler at Salzburg and urged him to make a settlement with the USSR. Far from considering this, Hitler was making plans to occupy Italy, which was even then preparing to leave the Axis camp. Mussolini's days were numbered, as Italy had been singled out by the Allies as the first of the three Axis powers to be defeated. On the night of July the 9th, 1943, British and American forces began landing in Sicily. Within a week, Allied armies under Generals Montgomery and Patton were driving north and west to clear the island, and it was only a matter of time before the Allies landed on the Italian mainland. In a pre-dawn meeting on the 25th of July 1943, 2 weeks after the Allied landings, the Fascist Grand Council voted 19-7 to oust Mussolini. King Victor Emmanuel III, who had been reduced to a figurehead by the dictator, appointed Marshal Badoglio to be the new Prime Minister. Arrested as he was leaving the palace, Il Duce was bustled off in an ambulance to a succession of heavily guarded hiding places, ending at an isolated hotel located on the highest mountains of the Apennines, the Gran Sasso d'Italia. Badoglio told the Germans that he was going to continue to fight, while at the same time beginning to negotiate in secret with the Allies. Even though Hitler knew nothing of the Italian plans, he suspected that they might be about to surrender, and so pushed forward his own plans to occupy the country. On September the 3rd, as the British Eighth Army crossed the Straits of Messina and landed in Calabria, the Italians signed an armistice to become effective on September the 8th. As soon as the armistice was announced, German forces began to disarm and imprison the Italian forces with whom they had so recently been allied. Meanwhile, Adolf Hitler had plans for Il Duce. The Führer maintained a high regard for Mussolini long after it became clear that Italy could offer little to the Axis cause, and ordered his friend's rescue. A specially picked team of SS and Luftwaffe parachutists, commanded by Otto Skorzeny, made a daring descent on the Gran Sasso on the 12th of September. After his dramatic rescue, Mussolini was bundled into a tiny Fiesler-Storch reconnaissance plane and flown off the mountain. From German-occupied territory, he was flown immediately to see Hitler. The Führer set up a fascist puppet state in northern Italy, which would continue to fight alongside the Germans. He installed the cardboard Caesar under heavy SS protection as head of the Salo Republic. Its seat was the village of Gargnano on the western shore of Lake Garda. As an early item of business, Mussolini established a tribunal to avenge the coup d'etat of 1943. His son-in-law, Count Ciano, was among those ordered executed on the 11th of January, 1944. Although a titular head of state, Mussolini remained a somewhat pathetic figure for the remainder of his life. He continued to inspect military formations and went about the business of running his republic with the aid of Marshal Graziani. But he was a broken man. The health of Il Duce, who once made a great show of his virility, had deteriorated since 1940. In addition to ulcers, he is said to have long suffered from syphilis, which affected his brain, and also from paranoia and claustrophobia. Even so, he knew who his friends were. When Hitler escaped the 20th of July bomb plot, Mussolini was one of the first to go to the Führer's Prussian headquarters in person, where he was shown how narrowly the Führer had escaped death. It was the last time the two dictators were to meet. Mussolini's Salo Republic survived little more than a year. As Allied forces entered the Po Valley in 1945, Mussolini moved his rump government to Milan on the 18th of April. Forced out after less than a week, he fled northwards in the hope of taking refuge in the Tyrol. Wearing a German greatcoat and helmet, he was found hiding in a German army truck at a partisan checkpoint near Lake Como. Communist leaders in Milan sent one Colonel Valerio Walter Ardisio to take charge of the captive. On the 28th of April, 1945, Il Duce and his mistress of 9 years, Clara Petacci, were machine-gunned to death. The next morning, their bodies and those of 4 others were hung by their feet at a gas station in Milan's Piazzale Loreto, where 15 Italian hostages had been killed some 8 months earlier. That evening, the corpses were taken down on orders of Allied authorities, who had Mussolini buried secretly in a Milan cemetery. And what of the man whose fate had been so inextricably bound with Mussolini's for so long? Adolf Hitler, Il Duce's ardent pupil and inevitable master, survived his fellow dictator by only 2 days, committing suicide in a Berlin bunker on the 30th of April. The twin pillars of brutalism and intolerance were consigned to the dust.